Hayes. There were 7 children in the family, 4 boys and 3 girls. I was the oldest girl. My father was a lawyer and a Presbyterian minister, and he was a man of means, so we were all quite well educated. I met my first husband following a trip to his farm, or his plantation in Gallatin, named Fairview. His name was Isaac Franklin. I went there on a business trip with my father when Mr. Franklin was not home. So I had the unmitigated audacity to write in his guest book that I liked his house and I had sent my cap for its owner. Well, when Mr. Franklin returned home, it didn't take him too long to follow up on my boast. And it wasn't too long afterwards that we were married. Now, although he was about twice my age, it was a very happy marriage. And when he died 8 years later, he left me a very wealthy widow with 3 young daughters. Unfortunately, within weeks of their father's death, my 2 oldest daughters, Victoria and Adelicia, also died. I sold Fairview and returned to Nashville with my youngest daughter, Emma, to be close to my parents. A year later, I met Mr. Joseph Acklin of Huntsville, Alabama. Joseph?
I remember it well, my dear. Looking lovely tonight. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's so nice to have visitors. You'd really be surprised now how few that we do get around here. We're glad you came. Well, now then, I met Mrs. Franklin at a ball given by Mrs. John Bell. And when Mrs. Bell came over and offered to introduce me, I said, well, Mrs. Franklin, she wouldn't care one whit about dancing with a mere soldier when her last partner had been a general.
Now you see how wrong you can be. It was about 2 years later, we were married, but ladies, not before the gentleman signed the mother of all prenuptial agreements.
All right, my dear, you've made your point, but I don't think you had anything to complain about in my management of your life. Well, shortly after our marriage, we began work on the estate that would become our summer home, Belmont. It's amazing for me to think this afternoon that in March of this coming year, the house will celebrate its 150th anniversary. Now, the parties and the dinners that we gave there, they were really something else. We loved to entertain, and many of Nashville's most prominent citizens were our guests there.
But all of that came to an abrupt halt in 1861 when the South seceded from the Union and our nation went to war. Many of our friends went to fight, some south and some north.
Well, I had fought with Texas in their War of Independence from Mexico and really had had enough of being a soldier. Still, Adelish and I, we wanted to do something to help out the Confederate cause. Now, we equipped a company that was part of the 34th Tennessee Infantry Regiment, and it became known as the Acklin Rifles. Now, down in Murfreesboro back in December of 1862, the Acklin Rifles, along with other companies that made up the 34th Tennessee, they captured a Yankee battery. Now, over 30 cannon were taken, as well as other arms. And this was quite an accomplishment. We were certainly very proud of them.
As we approach the 140th anniversary of that battle, the Battle of Stones River in Murfreesboro, makes me remember the events of that year of 1862. On a February Sunday morning, Fort Donelson fell to the Yankees. I heard about this at church and watched in dismay as General Johnson's Confederate Army retreated south through Nashville. It was a very frightening time because many Nashvillians were fearful that the Confederates were going to try to burn the city to keep it from falling in Union hands. Fortunately, this didn't happen, but just to be on the safe side, I sent my best carriage and 2 of my finest horses to my brother Oliver, who lived in Brentwood, Tennessee. I sent him there for safekeeping. A month later, Oliver would sign the oath of allegiance to the United States. My brother Hal refused to sign, and he was arrested and imprisoned.
I left that very night for our plantation holdings in Angola, Louisiana. The Yankees were definitely headed for the Deep South, and somebody needed to be there just to look after the crops and our property there. It's sad for me to say I would never see Adelicia or my family again, as I would die there just 1 year later.
May I add my story to yours, please?
Certainly.
Okay. Adelicia, you look lovely tonight. Is that a new dress?
I've already pointed that out. So.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't realize that. I'd like to introduce myself. My name is Dr. William Cheatham. I was a noted psychiatrist here in Nashville, and I helped design and create Central State Psychiatric Hospital. In June of 1862, my first wife and I were arrested for treason. She had been accused of passing information on troop movements to her brother-in-law, which was General John Hunt Morgan. Now, a year later, she died when we were on our way to a prison camp up north. They went ahead and released me and let me come back so I could finish my work here in Nashville, and I was left a widower to raise 2 small children.
On December 31st, 1862, the Battle of Stones River was fought in Murfreesboro. My church, the Downtown Presbyterian Church as it's now known, suspended services for the duration of the war and became an army hospital. Wounded from Murfreesboro were carried there for treatment.
Well, nothing lasts forever, and here again, this dreadful war came to an end.
When I had heard that Joseph had died in Louisiana, I made a desperate trip there to try to save the cotton crop from both friend and foe. It was finally smuggled out of the port of New Orleans and reached the Rothschild family in Liverpool, England, where it was sold for some $900,000. When the war ended, I had to go to London to get my money. So I went to Europe and to see the sights and to get my money. When I returned to the States, I visited our plantations in Louisiana, where many of our former slaves had stayed on as paid workers. The oldest of those was Uncle Phil. He had snow white hair and a very courtly manner like a royal chamberlain. He asked that while I was in London, if I had been able to see Queen Vicky, and was very disappointed to find out that I had not. I told him that she was in Scotland at the time I was there, and I never even caught a glimpse of her. Well, as per a proper gentleman, he asked when I might expect her to return her visit. When I might expect her to return my visit, you know. He thought she would come back to see me. Uncle Phil was always a very, very proper gentleman.
Well, in June of 1867, Adelicia and I were married. We then made our home at Belmont.
In 1884, I left Belmont with my daughter Pauline and later moved to Washington, D.C., where my oldest son, Joseph Jr., had been a state senator. Dr. Cheatham remained in Nashville to continue his medical practice with his son. In 1887, on a shopping spree in New York City, I became ill there and died in New York City of pneumonia. My body was returned here to Nashville, and my funeral was held at the Downtown Presbyterian Church. If you're ever downtown and you hear the bells chime, I hope you'll think of me because I donated those bells to the church. We thank you so much for coming tonight, and we hope you enjoy the rest of the tour.
Well, good evening. I'm Pauline Dunn Lewis. Major Lewis, we have more visitors. Major Lewis will be along in just a moment. Please don't think him rude, but I've learned a long time ago that if he's working on a problem, not to disturb him. I think he's very fortunate to have such a patient wife. As you may all know, Major Lewis is a civil engineer. He was responsible for Nashville having the Parthenon and also for Union Station. Perhaps he was a genius. He used to work all through the night. He would keep me awake, jotting down ideas while I was trying to sleep. And then the only way he could go to sleep is by rocking in a bed hung from the ceiling by chains. And yes, we did have children. 8.
Wow. Mrs. Lewis, you must have them convinced I am eccentric. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening.
I am Major Eugene Kastner Lewis. I wasn't a real major, please understand. I would not mislead you. It's only a nickname given me by schoolmates. Some of you seem to be studying on this pyramid. Yes, I designed it as our final resting place. As you know, the monarchs of Egypt used to preserve their mummified bodies for all eternity. But I don't need to be preserved for eternity. But let's hope so, at least until you conclude your visit.
And don't you know our children loved their father? When he would tell them stories about the war, their minds became alive. I guess y'all don't think much about the war, but we grew up during it. When Major Lewis would tell our children about the Yankees attacking Fort Donelson, they're just determined to believe that he was actually there fighting as a Confederate soldier. You remember hearing the battle, don't you, dear?
Yes, Mrs. Lewis, I do. During the Civil War, we lived near the fort. And when the Union Army invaded Tennessee, we could hear the big guns from the fort firing all the way down at the Union Navy. It seems like yesterday. When Abe Lincoln called for an invasion of the South, they began making huge ironclad ships that were new, so they could be fighting in shallow rivers, which other ships could not do. When the Union Navy floated up toward Fort Donelson, they were attacked by the large guns there. And the large guns there at that fort blasted the ships that were there. One of them's rudder was shut off. One of the pilots was killed, and the commodore of the fleet was wounded. They couldn't get out of there fast enough. But they then had fall upon harder times. The Yankees had a huge army. So they came and they attacked Fort Donelson, and the fort had to surrender. The Union Navy then sailed up the Cumberland River to the Cumberland Iron Works, where my father was a manager there. They took him aboard the ship and they tied him up. And they made him watch as they blasted his life's work to pieces. But I swore I would kill every one of them there. But my parents pleaded with them that they could send me off to Pennsylvania to school. So off I went. I could whip every one of those boys that were there. It's because of such of my aggressive nature there that I became known as Major. It was a sight to behold. Mrs. Lewis, I think you recognize this highway.
Oh, yes. The Lebanon Pike was not so wide then. I grew up with my grandparents at their home, Bel Air, which is just a few miles out that way. I hear Bel Air is still standing, but a new road, a Riley Parkway, has destroyed the old plum orchard. My grandparents insisted we live with them. Their house was so spacious. After they added the rear wing, it had 30 rooms. I know they would be grateful that Bel Air was still standing, but I wonder if anybody ever remembers them. You see, my mother's father was William Nichols. He was the mayor of Nashville in 1835. Suppose mayors aren't remembered too much. When he was mayor, Nashville was not the official state capital. It had been Knoxville and then Murfreesboro. But he was responsible for them purchasing the biggest hill in Nashville to build the capital on. And then Tennessee's legislators made it the official capital. I remember my grandmother, Julia. We used to go to their orchard and pick plums for preserves. Her father was Captain Little. He was with George Washington at Yorktown when the British surrendered. She used to say that was the first revolution, and ours with the Yankees was the second revolution. Maybe if you drive by Bel Air, you might remember them.
And if you pass by the Parthenon, please recall that it was I was the one that was there who had made it come to pass. And also, right after that was completed, I went to work immediately on the Union Station. And when that was completed, then on the viaducts on Broadway and Church Street. I was also responsible for picking the spot for the powder works during the World War. In 1903, Mrs. Lewis passed away. But I worked with the railroad for many years. And when I died in 1917, the train stopped running for 5 minutes in my honor. But please, if you do get a chance to go and visit the Parthenon and Union Station, please remember us during that time period. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. We're happy to have you come. I am Bud Douglas. May I introduce my wife, Sarah Crawford Douglas. My first two wives passed on. My first marriage to Arthur Rebecca Wright of Fayetteville gave me 4 sons and a daughter. I think she it is my understanding they are all alive. And they're here to hear about us and our home, Richland. Love and sweat went into our home. Richland Grove is no longer around, and I was very sad to hear that. St. Anne's Catholic Church out on Charlotte is there now. Bricks were fired on site. With 375 acres, we had plenty of good trees for lumber. I owned from where Richland Creek passes under the pike, back about a mile toward town. Have you been to Richland Park? That was a pretty sight, where a herd of deer could be found grazing on blue grass underneath huge oaks and walnuts.
I hope you do not think we are too forward, but we do think we have the finest home on Charlotte Pike. Now, I understand you have met Miss Ackland, and she will go on about Belmont. But there were many fine homes in Nashville at the time. Richland Grove had a winding staircase in the entrance, flanked by doors and rooms on either side with 15-foot ceilings. The library had beautiful walnut bookcases. We had lovely mahogany and walnut furniture sitting on fine rugs and beautiful Tennessee hardwood floors. Now, the Acklands do go on about Belmont and their cotton. But they were not the only family that dealt in cotton. Mr. Douglas and his brother were known in Nashville as the Cotton Kings.
Well, but Hugh and I had humble beginnings. Though our father was a doctor, he died when Hugh was 14 and I was only 9. He accumulated very little, left poor mother in the ditch. But she was desperate to make sure we had a good and a proper education. We lived in Leesburg, Virginia. northwest of Washington City. But our closest relative was Uncle William Dixon down in Tennessee. Well, it must have been desperate. Well, she sent Hugh and me on foot to Tennessee. I wish I understood what she hoped to do. She died before we ever saw her. Uncle William sought our education and set Hugh and me up with a general store in Fayetteville. We did well, and soon we owned a building on Market Street here in Nashville. We brokered cotton sales. When Lincoln's Yankees invaded, we had to order the destruction of $4 million worth of cotton to keep them from capturing it. Now, while we were destroying cotton, some folks, and maybe Mrs. Acton, were selling cotton. But we would try to overlook them. Speaking of overlooking, I could not overlook the horse Mrs. Douglas kept in our house.
Now I must explain that. The Yankees had taken every horse there was. They'd even taken the circus horses. The war was almost over and we had one very old, tired horse. One morning I took a bag of corn to the grist mill to be ground. I had this Negro boy that I had raised. His name was Jim. It was very common at the time. Even President Davis and his wife raised a black boy. So Jim went everywhere with me, and he thought he was my bodyguard. Well, we could do nothing when the Yankees stopped us and demanded my horse. Jim and I tugged and dragged that bag of grain back home, and I vowed vengeance. Several days later, the cavalry was marching horses they had taken from the farmers down Shiloh. Jim ran and opened the gate, and a few of the horses came in to graze on our lush bluegrass. We looked them over and picked the youngest one we could find. It took a while. We harnessed him. Don't you know, we walked that horse up the veranda, up those lovely winding stairs, and into the attic, where it resided for 6 months.
Those problems were nothing, though, compared to the deaths of my sons. Lee, please tell them what you know about Chickamauga.
Yes, Father. Now, as I recall, we were filling our canteens in a little creek named Chickamauga. This flowed down Lookout Mountain to where our army was. We knew the Yankees were close by because we had just pushed them back from the river that morning. But we couldn't see them for the trees. Now, later that afternoon, General Cheatham got orders to advance, but well, I'll tell you what, he had 5 brigades in his division. Now, our brigade was Maney's, and we were in reserve at first. Now, when you're fighting in a dense forest, you can't really tell what's going on. You just hear this roar, this deafening roar that intensifies, and all you do is wait. And it's that waiting that just makes you so nervous. I remember looking over at my friend Robert Stout, and he was so pale. And he told us that he had had a premonition. And everybody was laughing at him, just laughing. They were nervous. They just wanted to hear something other than the sound of their own breathing. But I could tell. I saw it in his eyes. I knew that the angel of death had touched Robert Stout. Now, we got orders to advance, and we were marching over this low ridge, and the bodies were so thick that they were just covering the ground. And all of a sudden, General Forrest came up and told us that we were right in the path of a Yankee division, and we needed to retreat, so we were running, and I remember Bobby, he got hit with a Yankee cannonball on his hip. He lost his leg and his hip, and old Robert Stout was dead before he hit the ground. And then I remember I lost my breath, and I lost my hearing, and everything was slow, and I got dizzy.
Please read my inscription. It's marked least you will think of our horse in the hat.
Good evening. I'm Reverend James H. McNeely. I preached at a number of area Presbyterian churches. I heard tonight that one of them still stands, which I helped found on West End Avenue. You may know of it, Westminster Presbyterian. Do you believe some have a calling to preach? Well, I felt it even as a child. I was born down at Charlotte in 1838. My father was a lawyer, and by the time I was just 13, he had me working as a deputy court clerk. But that work did not suit me. In 1861, I graduated from the Kentucky Theological Seminary in Danville. 1861, you recall, our war for independence began the same year. Instead of preaching in a church, I found myself as a chaplain in a brigade in what you know as the Army of Tennessee. The Yankees came to Nashville and, of course, captured Nashville, and it was our goal to liberate the city. There were 75,000 Yankees waiting for us in Nashville. We attacked the Yankees first at Franklin, though, but more Confederates died there that day than any day of the war. I was there for 3 days, burying our dead, including my own brother. We came on to Nashville, but a snowstorm hit, delaying the battle. We were cold, worn down, and hungry. But many times, this is just how it was. And so, eventually, we came on and began trying to set up what we could do. You have to bear with me, my memory fades. I was in along the Hillsborough Pike, within sight of a small dirt fort called Redoubt 5. Most of our dead now rest in Confederate Circle. I recall Mike Krantz from Cheatham County. I had given him a small Bible. He surrendered, but he was still murdered. My memory fails me in the attempt to recall our retreat from the battlefield of Nashville. There's only confused recollection of weary plodding through mud and slush, thinking the Yankees were on our heels. It would have been such a comfort had we known how our cavalry was holding on the Granny White Pike, fighting until nearly midnight. Due to the darkness, the Yankees never made much of a pursuit. We began to gather our courage, thinking we could turn and make another stand. But the Yankees never made much of a pursuit. When we reached Franklin, I determined to go to a friend's house who lived off the Carter's Creek Pike. I knew he would have clothes to replace the rags that were hanging off of me, but when I reached the West Harpeth River, the ford was flooded from the melting snow and I could not swim. I recalled a scripture from Isaiah 59:1 which said, "Behold, the Lord's hand is not shortened, that it cannot save, neither his ear heavy, that it cannot hear." And so I prayed. I waded on into the water until it came up to my armpits, and I paused. But I went ahead, and with each subsequent step, the shallower the water. Climbing out of the banks, I hurried along, fearing that I might freeze to death, but soon found myself at my friend's. His entire family set about to make me comfortable, but before I could finish my handsome supper, we could hear distant gunfire. With dry clothes, I set off to rejoin my brigade. My friend had showed me how to follow the Carter's Creek toward the main road to Columbia. As I walked along, I recalled Jeremiah 6:16. Thus saith the Lord, stand ye in the ways and see, and ask for the old paths, where is the good way, and walk therein, and ye shall find rest for your souls. And though the night was intensely dark, without a star to guide me, I soon came to campfires. I crawled as close as I dared till I could hear voices. When I heard them speak French, I knew they were our men, as some of the men from the Gulf Coast states spoke French. The next day I struggled through incessant rain, drenched to the skin by the time I found my brigade. Our division was under General Walthall. General Forrest commanded the rear guard and had requested General Walthall to help him. General Hood agreed, and Forrest said, now we will hold them back. And we did. We drove them back all the way to the Tennessee River. Much of the Army crossed the river on pontoon bridges. But amidst this awful defeat, the worst a Confederate Army suffered during the entire war, I still felt much pride in being a part of that rear guard. We finally crossed the river and dismantled the pontoons. And then I recalled Revelation 21 verse 4. God shall wipe away all tears from every eye, and there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor suffering, and there shall be no more pain, for the former things are passed away. Well, I wish I had more time with you. I continued preaching until 1921 and passed from this life the next year at the age of 84. My last congregation was Glen Levin Presbyterian out Franklin Pike, which still stands along with my home on Elliott Avenue. I sometimes feel as though I could return, but life is for the living. God bless.
Stephen Foster wrote that song in 1851. But you know, I don't believe he ever set foot in the state of Florida. Matter of fact, I know he didn't see the River Swanee. But I know about Florida because that's where I'm from. I'm buried over there in Confederate Circle. A lot of boys from Florida died up here and they're buried. I suppose we all wish we'd been buried back near our friends and family in Florida. But most of them died up here in hospitals or on the battlefield. Now, Florida was the butt of many jokes in my day. I don't suppose you remember John Randolph of Roanoke and what he said in the United States Senate. He said, and I quote, "Florida is a land covered in water, abundant in alligators, serpents, tadpoles, and all other noxious things. Why, a man would not immigrate to Florida from purgatory. No, sir, not from hell itself." Well, a number of us Floridians took offense at that statement, and some of us suggested that perhaps Mr. Randolph should go to hell and find out for himself. My family was from Georgia. We immigrated down to Florida to plant an orange grove. Now, in 1860, we had a presidential election, and did you know that Abraham Lincoln was not even on the ballot in Florida? Why, not in most southern states. And yet he was elected president anyway. Well, when he did, South Carolina seceded, followed by Mississippi, followed by Florida, and then all the other southern states right behind him. I joined the 4th Florida Infantry Regiment. Now, forming a regiment was no easy task in itself. Why, we didn't even have guns. But finally, the state government managed to purchase rifles for us from England. Of course, getting there was no easy task either. Union Navy had set up a blockade of all southern ports. So the English ships had to come down to the Bahamas, lay over there, then transfer their goods to blockade runners, who would make the dash into Jacksonville. Now, once we became a regiment in the Confederate Army, the state government no longer had any control over where we would be sent. So we were sent to Mobile Bay over in Alabama to serve as garrison troops. Now, if you like eating oysters, Mobile Bay is a fine place to be. But after a year of serving as garrison troops and not seeing any Yankees, the boys were itching for a fight. And then we got the news we were to be sent up to the Army of Tennessee, up near Murfreesboro, Tennessee, with winter coming on. We didn't quite know what to expect. They put us on these rail cars and sent us up through Georgia and then up through Chattanooga. You know, I do declare I believe Florida is the flattest state in the whole country. While many of us boys had never even seen a mountain before. So the scenery was spectacular. We had also heard that you Tennesseans were meaner than most Yankees. But when we got up here, we found that not to be true at all. The good citizens of Murfreesboro were as kind and courteous and hospitable to us as they could possibly be. And the ladies were more than beautiful, I might say. Not quite as beautiful as those ladies down in Florida, though. No offense intended. Well, December was an exciting month indeed. President Jefferson Davis came down from Richmond to review the troops at Murfreesboro. Not long after that, the gallant cavalry General John Hunt Morgan, he was married. And then they had these Christmas balls almost every evening. I remember those boys from Louisiana, they had one ball up in the courthouse there in Murfreesboro. And those rascals invited every single unmarried woman in Murfreesboro to their ball. I don't recall getting an invitation. Well, the weather was pretty fair up to that point. Then it turned off cold. A lot of freezing rain and sleet. That was hard on us boys from Florida. We weren't accustomed to that kind of weather. I remember one evening it sleeted and I lay awake all night long, teeth chattering, on that frozen ground. We heard rumors that the Yankee Army was coming out of Nashville and advancing toward Murfreesboro, and soon enough those rumors were confirmed. Most of the boys, they had been in 2 or 3 battles with the Army of Tennessee, but the 4th Florida, we were true green. We didn't know what to expect. This was our first fight. That evening, before the battle, we could hear the Yankee bands playing off in the distance in the darkness. Now, we had a fine band ourselves from the Florida. Most of those boys were from Tampa, and they struck up the Mobile Quick-Step, I do believe. Then the Yankee band out there in the darkness, they struck up Home Sweet Home. Then other bands joined in, and the music went on into the evening. And as I lay there listening to that beautiful music, I thought how strange it was that the next day we'd wake up and try to kill one another. About sunrise, we heard the sound of battle way over on the left of the Confederate wing. Now, we were on the far right end of the Confederate line, but we could hear the sound of the guns, we could hear the musketry, and we knew our boys had hit them Yankees in the right flank, caught them cooking breakfast. I hear those Yankees ran like scared rabbits through the woods. The boys captured a lot of cannons along the way there. But the Yankee line fell back on itself into a U shape, and the Yankees had over 50 artillery pieces at the point of that U. Well, they moved us out of the right side of the line and over to the center to help assault that position. Several assaults had already failed. The Yankees have been using canister in these cannons. Now, canister is nothing more than a large can filled with hundreds of these mini balls. 50 cannons, shooting 2 rounds a minute. They could put forth across that field 10,000 lead balls a minute. Our regiment was cut to pieces, and I took one of the rounds in the side. Well, they got me back to the hospital in Murfreesboro, and they patched me up and dressed my wound, but I had lost a lot of blood by that time. Well, they say the battle was a draw, but the Confederates pulled out a few days later, and the Yankees moved in and took prisoner all the rest of us left behind. And they put us on these filthy cattle cars and sent us back up to Nashville. Well, they put us in hospitals up there, and I lived about another month or so, hung on, but I took the fever, I guess an infection of some kind. And I died on February 4th, 1863. And as I lay there in that hospital bed, the only real comfort I had was thinking of home, thinking of that tune Mr. Foster wrote about.
Pass it around.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. Let me introduce myself. I am George Augustus Dickel, and this is my wife, Augusta.
Good evening. We're pleased to have your company.
I've been dead for over 100 years. Let's see. 108 to be almost precise. At the time of my death, an article in the Nashville newspaper stated that George A. Dickel Company was the oldest firm in Nashville.
Mr. Dickel, you weren't making whiskey, you were blending it.
Like I say, George Dickel, that's me. George Dickel believed to make the best Tennessee whiskey, there was one ingredient that was needed most, and that was time.
Well, Mr. Dickel, you never distilled a drop of whiskey in your life. In the 1850s, you was manufacturing boots and shoes. I believe you were a master mason and a member of company number 3 as a volunteer fireman. We married in 1855, or was it 1856?
I'm glad she came.
When Tennessee seceded from the Union in 1861, soldiers began passing through Nashville. That's when Mr. Dickel. You know what that noise is? My goodness.
A big storm coming up.
I've never heard noise like that in my life. You founded your liquor business in Nashville. Mr. Dickel, do you remember when one of your employees had that spring wagon designed with that false bottom in it where he could smuggle quinine and medicine? There was a number of wagons like that we found out were in Nashville, but no evidence was ever discovered that Mr. Dickel had anything to do with any of that illegal activity. My maiden name was Benson, and my sister Emma married Emmanuel Swartz. Emmanuel's brother Joseph joined the 1st Tennessee, and while he was in Knoxville, that's in East Tennessee, I believe it was March 1862, he died. And they buried him there with all kinds of military honors. My brother-in-law Emmanuel in 1867 was the bookkeeper of the George Dickel and Company, and became a partner, I believe, in 1881.
I was a little old to be a soldier. I was born in Germany in 1818.
And Mr. Dickel and I had no children, but if we had them, they would have gone and fought for Tennessee. Well, Mr. Dickel, we survived the war, and your dream you fulfilled in making the best sipping whiskey there was in the world. Why don't you share with our visitors the story of that?
Now, they put some of that story right on the new bottles here, and it was on the old one too. But it says here, back in 1870, George Dickel had a dream. He had produced the smoothest Tennessee whiskey around. And soon on a choice piece of ground down in Tullahoma, he began. He determined that one thing was needed was pure, clear water. So at Cascade Springs, at Cascade Hollow, he started his distillery. Now the creek gets the name from the water that falls down about 80 feet down a bluff, and then it cascades down the stair steps, right down into the head of the hollow, just up the creek from the distillery.
Mr. Dickel, do you remember when we were vacationing there? We found out that that was some of the purest spring water that there was.
She fell in.
The label then depicted a still and a copper steel and a worm, and it said George A. Dickel and Company, the Cascade Distillery. And the label also bore the slogan, mellow as moonlight. And that was because they discovered that the cooling of the mash in the moonlight made it really mellow. Although Mr. Dickel might have preferred to remain in the background, it's entirely appropriate that his name was on the label. Even though Mr. Dickel never distilled whiskey, he was the rectifier who blended it. And even though he never owned Cascade Distillery, his company became the exclusive distributor for the brew known as the Mellow as Moonlight. The company he founded, plus the distillery that he promoted, really ended up being his best blend. Mr. Dickel died in 1894, and he was 76 years old. And in his will, everything was left to me, along with instructions that I was supposed to sell it at the first opportune time, and then invest the proceeds. But I didn't do it. I traveled often to Europe. I think every year I went to Europe. I died in 1916, and except for a few personal things I left to my sister, everything else went to my brother-in-law. I had complete confidence in him that he would pretty much manage it okay, so that the results of that would actually go to our nephews and nieces.
Is the moonlight mellow?
Good evening. Thanks for spending some time with us.
Let's move on down here to the Brennan.
Welcome to our parlor. I'm Captain Thomas Ryman, and this is my lovely wife, Mary Elizabeth.
Hello.
I'm proud to see that the grand tabernacle that I built in downtown Nashville still stands. And I'm prouder yet that you all have refurbished it so nicely and now call it the Ryman Auditorium. But that was long after I had passed away in 1904. I was only 65. I might have hoped to live longer, but I had really accomplished about all one could hope for, as you will hope you will see. This is my stone. I designed it. On this side, there's a little fishing boat with a net. And over here, a grand steamboat. Let me tell you how one led to the other. And I owe it all to the great Cumberland River. Nashville probably wouldn't even be here were it not for the Cumberland River. It starts in East Kentucky up near the Virginia border and runs all the way to the Ohio near Cairo, Illinois. And in those days, before railroads and highways, rivers were the primary means of transport and commerce. My father and I made our living fishing in the Cumberland River, if you can believe that. May not want to try it now. And in the summertime, you might be surprised to learn that we sold ice.
Ice?
Yes, ma'am. We could take flatboats out on the Cumberland River and moor them in the shade of the bluffs, and then we'd fill them up with water. And as the water froze, we'd put in some more water and some more until we could cut the ice into large blocks, and we stored it underground until summertime. If y'all remember how hot it was last summer, you can imagine the kind of profits we made on that. Speaking of profits, I've heard tell that y'all are debating some kind of state income tax. Well, in those days, we didn't have any state or federal income tax. We didn't have a sales tax or a gas tax or none such of that. But most of the revenues raised by the federal government, we Southerners paid in the form of tariffs on imported goods from Europe. Looking back, I still think that had my old friend John Bell been elected in 1860, we might have resolved our differences with the U.S. government. They elected Abe Lincoln, who was a friend of the Northern industrialists. And when Abe demanded that Tennessee provide troops to invade the southern states that were then forming the new Confederacy, we Tennesseans were outraged, and we seceded from the Union. Now all soldiers are hungry, and I did real well selling fish to the Confederate troops until the Yankees captured me.
How'd that go?
Not real well. Fortunately, though, a pardon was soon arranged, and I was not in prison long. Now, unlike Adelicia Ackland, most of us Southerners were financially ruined after the war. But I worked hard, and I managed to save up about $3,000, and I built me a raft with a brush arbor on top. And just like old Tom Sawyer, I left Nashville and floated all the way down to New Orleans, and I bought me an old steamboat. And that was the beginning of my fleet. And before I died, I was owner or partner in over 30 steamboats, primarily working the Cumberland River and the Ohio between here and Evansville, Indiana. In 1884, I was able to build my family a fine new home up on Rutledge Hill. Y'all probably know where that is. There's the markers there yet today. It was a beautiful home with twin turrets that overlooked the Lower Broad and riverfront areas. Nashville in those days was pretty much of a boom town, and the streets downtown were lined with all kinds of fancy hotels and bawdy houses. And
Bawdy
saloons.
houses.
I have to confess
How
to
would you
spending
know about bawdy
my
houses?
share of time in those establishments. But
Now he tells me.
in 1885, I got religion, and I ended my intemperate life, and even stopped selling liquor on my steamboats. In 1888, I bought that lot down there for $10,000 and broke ground on the new Union Gospel Tabernacle, which was finished in 1892. And I hope you all continue to enjoy it. And next time you go down there, come by and see my statue and think about old Tom Ryman. Thank you.
Good evening, folks. How are you doing tonight? Let me introduce myself. I'm Thomas Brennan. I'm in the railroad business, specifically designing and building locomotives. I was born in Dublin, Ireland in 1826. I graduated from Trinity College, and I developed an interest in the railroad industry at an early age of 8. As much as I'm being Irish, I hate to give credit to any of the English for anything, but unfortunately, credit's due where it's due. And they did have the first viable railroad system in England 1 year before I was born. And at the age of 8, the railroad finally made it to Dublin, and I saw my first locomotive, which became a lifelong fascination. At the age of 23, something I'm extremely proud of, I designed and built the fastest locomotive that was in England at the time. And it's an achievement that I was proud of throughout my entire career. Several years after building that locomotive, I traveled across the Atlantic to Paterson, New Jersey to visit the Rogers Locomotive Works, to see what our competition was doing, to see what type of adventures would be here in the United States. At a party here in Paterson, New Jersey, I met a Miss Anna Plunkett, and she was from Nashville. I guess you would call it love at first sight, for as she returned home, I packed up and followed her and never went back to Dublin at all. So I stayed here with her, and I went to work at a local foundry called the Nashville Foundry Works. And eventually I became owner of that foundry, and I renamed it T.M. Brennan and Company. In 1850, the first railroad charter for this area was given, and it was given to Mr. Vernon Stevenson. As you can see, Mr. Stevenson was fairly well off, for his monument was just a little bit bigger than my tombstone right over there. So he was much well off. Mr. Stevenson was also good friends of Mr. Bonaparte III. As you can see that his monument is a duplicate of Bonaparte III's. There are 16 separate coffins inside there sealed up for him. So he was fairly well off. The reason Mr. Vernon Stevenson is important to my story is when the Great Succession came about, there was only 7 foundries that could cast cannons in the United States. 2 of them were in Richmond, and the rest were in federal territory. So they took our various foundries here, and believe it or not, Tennessee was ranked 6th before the war broke out in foundries. And we needed to learn how to cast cannons, and I had never cast one before. Now, he made his money when in 1850 when the Nashville-Chattanooga Railroad was chartered, and it made him extremely wealthy. And I built 12 locomotives for him in 2 years. So therefore, they took my foundry and asked us to convert it to making cannons, and we did. And the cannons tested out very well, with one exception. We had no machinery, no designs, no tooling whatsoever to rifle any of the cannons. And if everyone knows that rifle cannon is much more accurate, has more penetrating power, just far superior to anything that you would call as a smoothbore, which is just a slick tube on the inside. So what we had to do is in 1861, I took an Irish compatriot of mine and I sent him to Pittsburgh. And he was able to work his way into the various foundries there, and he was able to obtain plans, shall we say, for various rifling machinery. And he brought it back, and we built several rifling machines, and we actually got 1 or 2 of our cannons that we had precasted rifled. However, Fort Donelson and Fort Henry fell at the same time, and Mr. Nathan Bedford Forrest, on his way back through Nashville, was able to come through Nashville, and he saw the need of saving our rifling machinery. Not so much the foundry, it was as important as the rifling machinery was. And he was able to convince Mr. Stevenson to loan us one of his trains to put all of that machinery on there. And we did, and we sent it all the way back to Atlanta. Now we wanted to save the foundry works too, but Mr. Stevenson thought it was more important that he save all of his personal and private items and loaded up the rest of his trains with all of them and sent them back to Atlanta. So we didn't get to save very much of that. It was very interesting how he came about. We never did find out what happened to all of his private stuff when it went to Atlanta, because it just seemed to have disappeared. We don't know what it is, but he made his way back to Nashville as the rest of us did. I finished up the war as an ammunitions manufacturer in Alabama, and I stayed there. The war was over. I came back to Nashville, and me and Anna, we had our families, and we raised our families, and I continued working in various foundries and the railroad yards down here. In 1887, I passed away, and I was buried over there. A Major Lewis, some of you might know, he's over there. He was buried over there in that triangular pyramid, and he was also a foundry owner. And you can tell the difference in our wealth because of my little tombstone and his big pyramid is a large monument. So that's pretty much about it. Thank you.
You need to talk.
Oh, he's okay, good.
Look at that.
Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. I'm Caroline Meriwether Goodlett, and I grew up on a thoroughbred horse farm in Kentucky. When war came to the South, my family supported the Confederacy. My father gave thoroughbred horses to Generals Nathan Bedford Forrest, John Hunt Morgan, and Albert Sidney Johnston, to name a few. I did my part for the war effort, carrying needed medicine and clothing behind enemy lines. My brother was a colonel in the Confederate cavalry. He was killed in Nathan Bedford Forrest's first victory at Sacramento, Kentucky. Though Forrest won the battle, it was a hollow victory because of my brother's death. After the war, I moved to Nashville, in part so that my son could attend Vanderbilt. With all the news in recent weeks of Confederate Memorial Hall at Vanderbilt, I trust you know of the United Daughters of the Confederacy. I founded it here in Nashville in 1894. and served as its first president. We were the daughters of the veterans of the Second Revolution. The Yankees called our fathers rebels, but you cannot be a rebel if you're loyal to your state. Well, the Yankees were writing the history books on the war, and we could see our war for independence being reduced to a civil war. There was much work for the United Daughters of the Confederacy, and we set our goals as historical, benevolent, educational, memorial, and patriotic. My good friend Mrs. Porter here did great work to set up hospitals for our Confederate soldiers.
Good evening. I'm Felicia Ann Grundy Porter. I trust you remember my father, Senator Felix Grundy. He and my mother were born in Virginia during the First Revolution, the one with England. They moved west as young adults and settled in Nashville, Tennessee. I have two older sisters. Do you remember your earliest childhood memories? I think mine was when I was 4 years old. We were in a huge crowd in Nashville, and my father raised me up so I could see my 15-year-old sister Mary address the crowd. I didn't understand it at the time, but it was General Lafayette's visit to Nashville in 1825. He served under General Washington, and when the French Navy cut off Cornwallis at Yorktown, he shared in the glory and won the hearts of the colonists. Why, the people of Nashville even named Lafayette Avenue after him.
Yes, Nashville was an important city long ago, even before we were the state capital. But Nashville's real strength was her good people. I met Mrs. Porter's mother through our joint charitable works. We were concerned with the poor. Felicia's too modest to tell of the great work her mother did. She recognized that the poor children of the city needed to be able to read the Bible, but their parents were too poor to send them to school. She set up an outdoor Sunday school and taught them to read. Some Nashville ministers said spelling classes was secular education and inappropriate for Sunday. One Nashville minister went as far as to say it was a scheme by the devil to capture the youth of the city. Really? And to think of all the work Felicia's family did to establish hospitals here.
You may not remember my mother, but you may not remember my father, but I hope you remember my mother. On her grave, we had inscribed Ann Grundy, our mother, who taught us how to live and how to die. Miss Caroline Goodlet and I also worked together. In 1887, we incorporated to raise funds for the Confederate Monument. Have you all seen the monument? Soon after that, we had an Italian sculptor sculpting the soldier on top. Can you imagine a warm, sunny day in May of 1889? We had 10,000 people to come to the unveiling of the ceremony. Why, General Overton, you know John Overton from Traveler's Rest, he said, "The ladies of Tennessee have not forgotten to cherish the memories of the heroic dead."
Our heroic dead, bless their memory. In 1900, we became concerned with poor veterans who were unable to send their daughters to college. But let me relapse a bit. Do you know of the southern colleges the U.S. Army burned? Well, right over in Lebanon, they burned Cumberland College, the University of Alabama, and VMI. And not to mention all the colleges that didn't have the money, never found the money to rebuild. Do you remember all the classes from our universities, from North Carolina and Mississippi, that went off to war? And they never came home. They were to be the future leaders of the South. Well, after the war, the South was broke as the North grew rich. But a wealthy Northerner named George Peabody wanted to see public schools in the South. He established the $2 million Peabody Education Fund to promote public education in the 11 former Confederate states, and this at a suggestion from General Lee. Well, in 1902, the United Daughters of the Confederacy began working with Peabody, who was establishing a teaching college here in Nashville, to build a dormitory for young women. Well, in 1914, the first classes were held there. That was the year I died. But I've learned that the money was raised and the dormitory built during the Depression of the 1930s. I think of all the work to honor our ancestors, and now to suffer the insult of having the name Confederate removed. I hate to end on such a sad note, but thank you for coming out tonight, and please do come again.